Thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk to you about using stories and oral histories in genealogical work based off of examples from my family and my friends. Um, so our lives and the lives of our family members, really, they're extraordinary. We may think that we live in a typical family, but once we ask questions and show a genuine curiosity, we inevitably learn exactly how amazing our family members are. So, I'm going to talk to you about some stories of my extraordinary family. And this includes name changes, curanderas, a 40-year-old tradition, and NASA. So, how did those all uh, fit together? This lived experience of my family members shows that they are trailblazers, culture bearers, and arbiters of many firsts. And I think that your families have those too. Um, so I could tell you that I'm Valerie. I was born and raised in Topeka, and I could leave it at that. And you'd be like, okay, that's nice. For many of us in this room, you were probably also born and raised in Topeka, right? So what? Um, but what if I told you that my grandfather on my dad's side, Mendoza, immigrated from Mexico in the first decade of the 20th century? So the story gets a little more interesting if I tell you that, right? But unless you're Native American or you have enslaved ancestors, we all have immigrant ancestors, right? Okay, thank you. um, but what if I told you that his last name is not Mendoza? And my last name should not be Mendoza either. Now we're talking about a story, right? So in the first decade of the 20th century, my grandfather came from Mexico. When he was crossing the border, he was with two half brothers or step brothers. I'm not sure exactly which, but their last name was Mendoza, and his last name was different. And he was afraid that if he had a different last name from his brothers who he was crossing the border with, that he would get stopped or they would get separated or something would happen. So when they were at the border checkpoint, he just told him his last name was Mendoza, and that was it ever since, right? The story in my family goes, and this is kind of like an urban legend because it's like passed down and passed down, right? But our last name, or his last name before he crossed the border, was Rocha, right? And so for the genealogists in the room, especially if anybody studying immigrants, right? We know the last names get changed, right? Ellis Island, you had a family member with one of those Polish last names that have no vowels, right? Those names get changed, right? So these things are really hard. So if I went to Mexico and tried to look for Juan Mendoza in the town where we knew he was from, I wouldn't find him because that's not his name. Interestingly enough, for this story, I knew this growing up since I was a teenager. I knew this story that Mendoza wasn't our last name, but it wasn't until this last year that it ever occurred to me to ask what happened to his two brothers. That story has been lost in our family, and I even asked my dad yesterday. He has a Friday outing with his siblings, and his oldest sister is in her 90s. And he asked her, and she's like, I don't know. So that part of the story has been lost, but I find it interesting that I never thought to ask about those two brothers, right? Because I've never growing up, I didn't know any cousins from those two brothers, our extended family just did not extend towards that side of the family. So this is my grandfather Juan, and this is his wife, my grandmother Petra. And Petra She was what in Spanish is called a curandera, or a healer, traditional folk medicine, right? Healer. When I was an infant, my soft spot fell in, which is not typical of babies, right? That should not happen. So my parents took me to my grandmother, who took me to another curandera who knew what to do to get my soft spot to be where it was supposed to be, right? And that involved what I've been told, don't try this at home, right? Is holding me upside down by my feet and then placing fingers in my mouth to gently push that soft spot back in place. It worked. My grandmother learned this technique from this other woman and then later started using it herself. One of the things I like about this story is that, you know, knowing where your skills end and going out to someone else who knows what to do, right? But then also learning from that person. I also asked my dad yesterday, well, what were some of the things that she could do? And so she cured stomach ailments with different types of herbs. There was also mal de ojo, or the evil eye, right? Which is something that she could also cure. So, so this makes my family story a little more interesting, right? So as you might imagine, coming to Kansas, they faced discrimination, as did a lot of Mexicans all across the country. This particular sign here is for Texas, but and it was put on restaurants. So it wasn't unusual to see these types of signs on restaurants in Topeka here. And my mother told me a story about her dad back in the day. So this would have been in maybe the 30s or 40s. My grandfather was born here, her dad, Robert Gomez, and probably was the 40s because he was married by this time, I think. So we went to, and they lived in this neighborhood that was off of Brannard Trafficway, not Oakland, but this neighborhood that was called Neutral because it was between Oakland and the Bottoms neighborhood here in Topeka. So he went to this restaurant. Normally, Mexicans were only allowed, if signs like this were on the door, you knew, A, you couldn't go in there at all, or sometimes there were signs that said Mexicans, Negroes, and Indians go out back. And that meant that you had to order your food from the kitchen door out back. They did not want you in the establishment whatsoever. So my grandfather, being outraged by this system, right? My mom told me this story. He goes in to a restaurant one day, I'm not sure exactly which one here in town, and he orders what he wants, right? He just walks in there. So he was a very light-skinned man. He had gray eyes, they weren't brown, and he could pass, right? And he spoke English, right? He spoke perfect English, as demonstrated by ordering in this restaurant. So he orders his food. The clerk, and it had one of these signs. The clerk gives him his food. He pays. And as this exchange is going on, my grandfather starts speaking in rapid fire Spanish, saying, you know, swearing at the man, saying, ha, you know, making fun of him. You just served a Mexican, you idiot, right? And then all of this in Spanish. The clerk's eyes, as you can imagine, probably get big. His mouth probably opens. He's like, "Oh no, what did I do?" And you know, other patrons in the restaurant can hear him. And then my grandfather hightails it out of there before they can call the police or throw him out or you know have anything to happen to him. That was his way of resisting this this discrimination, right? So some of the other things I do besides talking to my family members and asking them, learning about these kinds of stories, is actually also do formal oral histories. And right now I'm working on this project about the Bottoms neighborhood, which is here in Topeka. This is a neighborhood that was occupied by, it was a mixed neighborhood, right next to the Santa Fe tracks. Kind of if you're all from Topeka and you know where the Ramada Inn is, that way to the river and to the railroad tracks. So kind of like 4th Street, 6th Street, to the river going north, and then to the railroad tracks going east, and then Topeka, Kansas Avenue on the west side. So this used to be a neighborhood. If you've seen it now, you know that one, it's under construction because of I-70, but two, it's mostly, there's either nothing there or Hallmark was there, that sort of thing. So this neighborhood used to have houses. It used to be a thriving neighborhood, mixed neighborhood, black, brown, Native American, whites. Most of these people either worked at the Santa Fe or Hills, which is also still has a plant down there, right near the river. So in the late 1950s, early 1960s, that's when they decided to put I-70 through there. And in order to do that, they people had to move out, right? So imminent domain. So all these people were bought out, forced to move. Most of them did not want to move. And so I'm part of a team that's doing an oral history project that's going to be made in a documentary about the former residents of that neighborhood. And they talk about, you know, how they miss living there, you know, how it was hard to move. They've had a reunion for the last 30 years of people who formerly lived in that neighborhood. And so we're doing more formal oral histories. For those types of situations, right? I have a list of prepared questions. Sometimes I give them to people in advance. You know, I ask them certain things. And one of the things I asked about is, you know, what type of school you went to, what were the sounds, what were the smells like? Try to get them back into, you know, that era in their mind, right? And so one of the best practices when you're doing most of these formal types of histories is to ask at the very end, is there anything else you want to tell me that we haven't discussed or that I haven't asked you about, right? Because I don't know what I don't know as a historian. And so I was asking one of these former residents, that Phil Gutierrez, and he told me a story about his mother. In the 1920s, his mother, who was an immigrant from Mexico, didn't really speak any English, right? But she went to the movie theaters one day, probably on, you know, Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening or something. And back in the day, movie theaters were segregated. Blacks and Mexicans had to sit in the balconies, and the white patrons could sit, you know, on the main level. So she must have got there late or something, or it was a really popular movie, and all the seats in the balcony were taken. So she went and sat in a seat on the main level. And the usher came to her and said, "You can't sit here, you have to sit in the balcony." And she said, maybe she did speak English, because she told him, the seats are full, right? There are no seats up here. That's why I'm sitting here. And she said, and the usher told her, "Well, you can't sit here. I'm going to go get the manager." I said, "Okay, go get the manager." So we did. The manager comes and, you know, says, "You can't sit here. You have to sit in the balcony." And she explains it all over again. The balcony's full, so I'm gonna sit here. And the manager's pretty insistent. "No, you're gonna have to leave then." And she's like, "Well, no, I paid my ticket. I paid for my ticket. I want to see the movie. I'm gonna stay." And so the manager finally says, "You know what? I will refund you your money." And she's like, "Okay, that's fine." So he goes back, gets the money, hands it to her, and she just looks at him and at the money in his hand, and she says, "That's not my money." And he says to her, "What are you talking about? What difference does it make? Here, take this money." And she looks at him and she says, "Exactly, what difference does it make? I am the same," you know, the implication being, I'm the same as all these other people. And she didn't leave, she stayed. And I love this story because you can imagine a woman in the 1920s, right? Decades before women's liberation, speaking that way to a man in authority, and a woman of color, an immigrant woman, right? Doing that, sticking up for her rights. But that's one really awesome example of kind of what you get when you ask those open-ended questions. So if you're from Topeka, you know that the fiesta is one of the Mexican community's point of pride. It started in 1933 to help Our Lady of Guadalupe Church pay its electric bills during the Depression. And it started out just as one night, the parishioners selling food, having, little carnival games, dancing, music. Well, they had so much fun, they're like, let's do it again. And so then it grew to 3 nights. This is all in the middle of July, y'all. So, and if you ever go to the fiesta, you know that it's always 100 degrees that week. And in 1939, they decided that they were going to have a queen contest to help raise more funds for the church. And you would get to be queen at that point in time if you sold the most tickets, right? And so this is my grandmother in the middle, who was queen, my mom's mom. And on this side is my grandfather's sister. So my grandmother, Hazel Gomez, and then this is Aurora Gomez. So they later became sisters-in-law. So Aurora was my grandfather's sister. That makes sense. Need a family tree here. So I asked, when I was in grad school many years ago before my grandma died, I recorded her. I just asked her some questions, and I knew she was queen in 1943. So I asked her, well, how did you win? And so she told me that the tickets were 5 cents. She told me she sold the most tickets to servicemen, because 1943, right, World War II. Well, after she died, I got a letter or an email actually, from the YWCA here in town. And they wanted to know more about my grandmother. Because one of the things she did not tell me in that interview was that she helped form, during World War II, an organization that came to be known as Y Señoritas. So the Y is in YWCA, right? But Señoritas, women in Spanish, to help entertain the soldiers, the Mexican soldiers who were here in town, ostensibly, I think, because of Forbes, during World War II. And through that, that's how she got to know so many soldiers that were around that helped her to win this crown. One interesting thing, so I told you about my grandfather, Juan, right, and how my last name is not Mendoza. Well, Hazel is not her name. When she entered elementary school at Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic School, the nuns changed her name. Her given name was Jesus or Jesusa. And if you were in here earlier, Eric Anderson was talking about Indian boarding schools and how they're trying to assimilate and get rid of the Indian, and so all the Indians were given Christianized name. Similar type of thing. So the nuns gave her the name Hazel. As you can tell, I refer to her as Hazel. So she later actually officially changed her name, and her legal name became Hazel. But her mother, my great-grandmother, never ever called her that, right? That was not her name. That was not her given name. So again, for the genealogists in this room, that is another way that might be hard to research people who have, right, those quote unquote foreign sounding names. So now I want to jump ahead here a few years. And I want to tell you, this is my son took this photo. As you can see, there's Topeka High, the halls of Troy. So again, for any of those of you from Topeka. So imagine Topeka High, early 1960s, less than a decade out from the Brown decision, right, which desegregates schools. So my dad went to Topeka High. He went to Our Lady Guadalupe Church, Catholic school, and then East Topeka Middle School, and then Topeka High. Parents were both immigrants. Both his parents spoke Spanish, right? So all the teachers, all administrators at Topeka High, then, and almost pretty much now, probably 90% now, all white, English speaking. Yeah. So my dad is the 5th of 8 kids. Is that right? Yeah. And he wanted to go to college, right? That was his aspiration. He loved books. In fact, I was the first Wednesday of every month, my dad gets together with his friends from the neighborhood from grade school. And I was invited to join them once. The only woman who was ever allowed at that luncheon up until that point. So it was a great honor. And I said, tell me some stories about my dad. And so one of his friends, Gilbert Ramirez, said, your dad always had a book. Wherever he went, there was always a book. And so my dad loved learning, right? Wanted to go to college. But at that time, maybe even now, probably up for debate, but definitely at that time, if you were a student of color, if you were Black, if you were brown, if you were Native American, you were tracked into vocational education, right? It was assumed that you weren't smart enough to go to college. So he was, had to take shop class, woodworking, all that stuff. Actually, I still have the table in my living room that he made. What is it? Topeka High. It's this gorgeous mid-century modern. I love it. That's my thing, mid-century modern. A table, but he had to really fight to be able to take algebra, to be able to take chemistry, to be able to take physics, right? And he did it. I don't know how he was able to advocate for himself like that, because again, there were not any sympathetic people in there. It must have been his great grades, his, just desire to learn. He graduated, went to Washburn, got a degree in physics. Shortly after I was born, 3 months, I think, in 1967, my mom and dad moved to Houston so my dad could work for NASA, right? I always knew that I'd lived in Houston when I was a baby, but it wasn't until I was older, till I asked, why were we in Houston? Then it came out, oh, I worked for NASA in the 1960s, right? What's going on in the late 1960s at NASA? Yeah, we're building rockets to the moon. It was a short-lived stint, and it wasn't until they came back home, and I'm gonna talk about that in a second. But it wasn't until this year, all these questions come up. I don't know, maybe I had more time to think about it. I was like, how'd you even get that job, Dad? Not how did you get it, but what even made you apply, right? Again, no role models, right? He didn't know anybody who worked at NASA who asked him to apply. And he was like, I just did it. Why not? And it reminded me, when I was in high school, my parents gave me 2 pieces of advice, different times, unsolicited. My mom said, because she could tell I was really stressed, I'm this type personality, and she's like, you know what? Just go take time to smell the roses, that metaphorical, take a breath, right? And I tell my son's a sophomore in college now. I tell him that too. Like, this was before self-care was a thing, right? And that's basically what she was telling me. My dad's advice, which I still adhere to this day, is, don't self-select out, right? Let them tell you no. Don't not apply for a job because you think you're going to turn you down. And I think that's what that whole thing with NASA was, right? It's just like, I'm going to try. And lo and behold, what happens? And I think he was probably, this is one of the research projects I want to do in the near future is, I'm going to guess, he was one of the first, if not the first, men of color to work in Houston at NASA, right? So they were there for a few months, came back, not because my dad couldn't handle it, but just because they wanted to be closer to home. They had a newborn. Me wanted to be near family. I was probably you know, a little overwhelming, having a baby. Um, but when my parents returned from Texas, um, they became involved in something called the Chicano movement, which is a Mexican-American civil rights movement. And kind of the icon of that, or the icons, would be Cesar Chavez with the farm workers and Dolores Huerta. There were all sorts of things, right? In the Chicano movement, it got its inspiration from the African-American civil rights movement. So very similar ideas, right? Sense of justice, sense of self-worth. You know, we want our children educated. We want, you know, better jobs. We want political representation. And so they became super involved, and they started a LULAC chapter here in town, and LULAC stands for League of United Latin American Citizens, and it was an organization, a nonprofit organization that was started in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1939. In the early 1970s, one of my parents, we had friends, distant relatives came back from California. They had been working with Cesar Chavez. They heard about LULAC. They're like, you know what, there's this national organization. If we start a chapter in here in Topeka, we can do, you know, try to do all of these things, and we can, you know, have the backing of a national organization to give us clout. And so they did. And one of the first things they started was this senior center, whose photo you see behind me. The senior center is still open in Oakland 50 years later. And for that 50th anniversary, I started interviewing the remaining founding members of the senior center. And so one of the things that LULAC chapter did was in 1977, it started a fundraiser to benefit the senior center, and also to start scholarships for students in the neighborhood. And it was called the LULAC Little Miss Sweethearts Dance, right? And so the idea was that, you know, you would sell tickets, it was a dance, right? But you would also have children running for king and queen, and it was kind of modeled off of the Fiesta Queen thing. And so the kids would sell tickets, right? Whoever sold the most tickets would be crowned queen. And I knew about this since its beginning because my sister, my younger sister, Elizabeth, was the very first queen, right? And my brother and my other sister ran for king and queen as well. After college, I moved away, but I moved back here in 2012. And ever since then, I've always, every year, I volunteered for it. My mom, you know, since 2012, had been organizing the whole thing. So I'm doing these interviews, right, on the founding of the LULAC chapter here in town for the 50th anniversary. And I learned that whose idea was this 40-year event? My mom's. And I never knew that. She told me, you know, that they were trying to think of fundraisers. They had done a lot of food fundraisers and, you know, garage sales and that sort of thing. And then she was the one that came up with the idea for this this dance, the Sweethearts Dance. It happens in February, right? And they have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars over the last 40 years, right? They've sent hundreds of kids to college with a scholarship raised for this money, you know, from this money, from this dance, right? What a legacy, right? So we think our families aren't interesting or unique. And you know what? I fell in that category too. Guy, and I'm telling you all about my parents, right? And I'm like, I have no stories like that. 2 years ago, I get an email. And it's from the University of Michigan. And there are these people there and saying, hey, you know what? We want to start a project about the first 100 Chicana or women of Mexican descent who got their PhDs in history. Guess who was one of them? Me. I'm like, what? What? I am worthy of an organization? Never occurred to me. Never. Right? And as you can see, they're having a conference in, it's going to be in February, about us. But, right, if it wasn't for people like me and these other 99 women, these stories that I've just told you, nobody would know about them, right? Because we're the people who are interested in them, and we're the people who want to make sure that these stories get out. So, just a few kind of to make this, give you some ideas on how to do this and how to find these interesting stories, right? They can be informal, and all these tips are for informal. It can be anytime, right? It can be around the dinner table. It can be when you're, taking somebody to the airport or the doctor's office. It doesn't have to be super, super formal, right? The two really key things: you have to be genuinely interested in these stories, and you have to listen, right? So right now I'm working on a project interviewing Vietnam veterans, right? And my dad's younger brother, my uncle, he was a veteran during the Vietnam conflict, but he never talks about it. And so I just assumed it was this taboo topic, because some people are, traumatized by it. Nobody ever talks about it. Nobody. 2 weeks ago, maybe, I saw him at a family function. I was like, hey, can I interview you? It's okay if you don't want to sit. And he said, yes. I haven't done it yet, but I'm super excited. And I thought he was going to say no, but I was like, using my dad's advice, don't self-select out, right? Just ask. He can say no, it's okay. But he said yes. So I'm really excited to hear what he has to say. Document it, right? Take a photo. You don't have to record it, but you can, and you can just use your phone, right? You don't need fancy equipment. It's perfectly fine if you just use your phone. Sometimes an object will help start a conversation, like a photo is a good thing, like, hey, what can you tell me about this photo? And then you can go on. It helps jog the memory too. So when I was interviewing my parents about the LULAC project, they were talking and they were like, yeah, Rosemary this, and my mom that. And so I was recording it, right? And so I had to stop and say, Rosemary who, right? So I knew who they were talking about, but people, 10 years from now are not going to know who they're talking about. So I had to, make sure that got on. So ask for specifics, right? If you need to. And then those open-ended questions, right? So tell me, how did that, and I think that's how I found out about sweetheart dance thing at my mom. I was like, how did the sweetheart dance all get started, right? And then you should always let whoever you're talking to know, hey, if I ask you a question that makes you uncomfortable or you don't want to talk, you don't have to answer it, right? Or sometimes I do this too, especially if I'm recording it. I'm like, if you do not want me to have this on just recorded, just tell me and I'll stop it. And you can just tell me and it won't be preserved for, whoever. Especially if you're interviewing older people, take breaks, right? Sometimes I need a break for myself because it's really intense, right? Talking and giving them all of your attention. We're not used to doing that anymore. So, and then again, is my story about the movie theater. Always end with, is there anything you want to tell me that we did not talk about? And then sometimes giving questions in advance if it's more formal, hey, are you free? Thanksgiving's coming up, y'all. This is a really good time to get family stories. I always ask permission with the storyteller if you can share it with other family members. They may or may not want you to, right? Always thank your storyteller. Thank you for the time. Thank you for, talking to me, sharing your knowledge. And then, yeah, like I said, give questions in advance. So that's all for me. Any questions I can answer or comments? Your tips that you have for talking with family members or telling stories? Mm. Generate. Mm. Have you done genealogical work in family work? I have not, but my uncle has done a lot of that. So yeah, so it's there for me to look at. And so whenever I have a question, actually, I ask him, at least on one side of the family. Yeah, yeah. Other questions or comments? That's the side of the family that has not done the genealogical work. So no. But we were at a funeral recently, and my mom hooked me up with a distant relative who seemed to know tons of stuff. So she might know the answer to that. But yeah.
If anyone else has a question, I have a story about that. Must have been.
This is my dad.
There was a call to our house, and nobody understood what they wanted. My little voice, over in the south, was calling on behalf of some Mexican who apparently, as near as I could tell later, much later, he was seeking asylum and he needed somebody to vouch for him. He called our house, nobody knew him. And we were afraid that we gave out vouch for him, we were gonna be totally responsible for this person. And secondly, my parents, especially my mother, was not a US citizen. So we were always under threat of the immigration department coming in and taking our parents away. So we always tried to be very secretive and uninvolved. And so this poor person, I think, was one of Dad's brothers.
But you guys didn't know. Yeah, that story had been lost. Yeah. Yeah.
Did they leave you a phone number so somebody could backtrack?
Mhm.
Oh, they never.
Yeah. Did you have a question or comment?
Name changes. I think a lot of people that have known about their family who's immigrated has things on name changing there. But yours is pretty, it's.
Mhm.
Other families gone through something?
Yeah, we don't bring it up a whole lot, but every time meet a person who has that other last name, Rocha, I'm like, God, I wonder if we're related, you know. But yeah, that again, that's the side of the family that hasn't done the genealogical work. So yeah, yeah.
A couple of stories with regard to names. I worked for the state of Kansas for over 30 some years, and one day the head of personnel called me in and said, your name is not John. What? Because your birth certificate shows you're Juan.
Oh, oh dear.
And so I had to go change my name to
Legally.
John, or suffer the consequences. But that's something, as we come across the border and we want to be accepted, we try to get rid of our customs, traditions, change our names, try to change our accent. We wanted to give our kids English sounding names like Valerie. And you can spell. I was lucky I was born day of St. John the Baptist. Traditionally, were named after the saint day we were born, and I had brothers with Steamboat, Stephen.
Oh, wow.
And that was to their detriment all their lives, pretty much like our last names. We may look white, but our last name gives us away. And our accent also gives us away. So I struggled for many years to get rid of my accent. And finally I embraced it, started speaking Spanish again. But there is that process that occurs with families to change their name, mostly first names, to get away from the culture that way. And it is that we name our children after our grandparents, their grandparents. So you can usually correlate a kind of a family tree that way.
Yeah. But something else about my dad's name is that he's a junior on some documents and not on others. So my mom always laments, that, if he goes first, she's got to prove all this stuff. But it also has genealogical implications too, right? For people you're researching, they may be juniors or thirds, and then that gets dropped off. And then, is this really the person I'm looking for? Is this not, So, yeah.
My husband, when he was born, mother said, as well. He's the only one.
Wow. Yeah. And spellings. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So,
So if child's name Jesus, which means Jesus, is that what goes on the birth certificate, or do they manage that?
mhm. Yeah.
Jesse, I think, is
A nickname. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Right. Well, thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your.